She was 26 and out of work when she drove to Apalachicola with $200 and a chef's knife roll that was worth more than her car. She had cooked the line in New Orleans for 6 years. Then one Tuesday, the restaurant locked its doors, and the man who owned it disappeared with everyone's last check. And with the back fees on a dead slip, she took a 38-foot wooden shrimp boat that the marina was about to cut up for scrap. The hull had a soft plank. The engine hadn't turned over in 2 years. The harbour master told her she'd be lucky to keep it floating through hurricane season. But what nobody knew was that up in the forepeak of that old boat, lashed under the bow, was a brass-cornered chest that hadn't been opened since the man who built his whole life around her had died, and what was inside it would change how she understood the rest of hers. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Della Ferris was born in East Point, Florida, across the bridge from Apalachicola, in a house her grandfather had built on pilings with his own hands. That detail matters because it explains the rest of her. East Point is not a tourist town. It is a working town, or it was. A strip of oyster houses and shrimp docks and net shops along a 2-lane road, with the bay on one side and the pines on the other. Her grandfather, a man named Pap Ferris, tonged oysters off the public bars in the bay for 50 years, and Della spent every summer of her childhood on the water with him before she was old enough to know that most children did not spend their summers that way. She knew the smell of bay mud and diesel and oyster shell by the time she was 4. She knew what a culling iron was and a tong, and what it meant when the wind came hard out of the southwest in August. Pap did not talk much. He showed her how to read the tide off the pilings, how to tell a good bar from a worked-out one by the color of the shell that came up, how to back a skiff into a slip without scraping the dock. He told her once that the bay was a system, and a system would feed you if you understood it, and would drown you if you didn't, and that the only sin on the water was pretending you knew something you didn't. She was 8 when he said that. She did not forget it. Her mother left when Della was small. Her father drove a delivery truck out of Panama City and was gone more than he was home. Not unkind, just absent in the way of a man who had run out of things to say. So it was Pap who raised her, in the practical sense, and it was Pap's death, the winter she turned 17, that ended the only life she had known. He went the way watermen go, quietly, in the chair by the window that looked out at the bay, with the marine radio still murmuring on the shelf. The house was rented from the same family that had rented it to him, and they were sorry, and they gave her until the end of the month, and that was that. She had nowhere to be, and a talent that nobody in East Point could pay for. Della could cook. She had been feeding herself and Pap since she was 12, on what came off the water and what was cheap at the IGA. And somewhere in those years, she had learned to make a roux that didn't break, and a stock that tasted like more than its bones. A woman who ran a cafe in Apalachicola gave her a job washing dishes the spring she turned 18. And within a year, she was on the line. And within 2, she had saved enough to take a bus to New Orleans, because that was where cooking was supposed to happen. The way young people believe a thing is supposed to happen somewhere other than where they are. New Orleans took her in the way that city takes in anyone willing to work harder than is reasonable. She started at the bottom, on garde-manger, plating cold dishes in a basement prep kitchen with no windows. She moved to saute. She moved to the fish station, which suited her, because she understood fish better than the boys who had learned them out of books. By 24, she was a sous chef at a restaurant in the warehouse district with white tablecloths and a wine list as thick as a hymnal, working 90-hour weeks, sleeping 4 hours a night, living in a shotgun apartment uptown with a roommate she rarely saw because their shifts never lined up. She was good at it. Everyone said so. And she felt, most days, the specific, flat exhaustion of a person who is doing exactly what she set out to do and cannot remember why she wanted it. The kitchen was a system, and she had mastered the system, and the mastery had stopped meaning anything around the time she stopped noticing the food. She plated 400 covers on a Saturday and could not have told you what any of it tasted like. Pap would have had a word for that. He would have said she had gone to sea in a boat she'd never looked under. The end came on a Tuesday in late September, which she would remember because Tuesdays in restaurants are slow and nothing is supposed to happen on them. She came in at 2 for prep, and the back door was chained. There was a notice from the sheriff taped to the glass, the legal language of a seizure, and a small knot of cooks and dishwashers standing on the sidewalk in their checkered pants, reading it over each other's shoulders. The owner had not paid the rent in 4 months. He had not paid the purveyors. He had not, it turned out, paid the staff for the last 2 weeks, and the checks they were holding from the week before that were going to bounce, and the man himself was somewhere none of them would find him. Della stood on the sidewalk in the heat and did the math. She had a little over $200 in checking and a check for $1,100 that was now worth nothing, and rent due in 9 days. She had her knives, which were good ones, German steel. She had bought one at a time over 6 years and kept sharper than anything else she owned. She had a car that ran. She had, when she counted it honestly, nothing she would miss. The roommate was moving in with a boyfriend at the end of the month anyway. The city had given her a trade and taken back everything else, and standing there, she understood that she had been waiting a long time for a reason to stop. And now she had one. And the only direction that felt like anything at all was south. She did not decide to go home so much as run out of reasons not to. She packed the car that night. It did not take long. 2 duffel bags, a box of books, the knife roll, a cast iron skillet that had been Pap's. She gave the roommate the furniture and the deposit and was on the interstate before noon the next day, heading east along the Gulf, with the windows down because the air conditioning had quit the summer before, and she had never had the money to fix it. The drive took most of a day. Louisiana flattened into Mississippi, and Mississippi into the long pine corridor of the Florida Panhandle. And somewhere past Pensacola, the land began to feel like hers again. The slash pine and the palmetto and the rivers running brown and slow to the Gulf. She crossed the bridge into East Point at dusk. The bay opened up on her right, wide and silver-gray in the last light, and the oyster houses stood along the water the way they always had. Fewer of them now, some of them dark. The smell came through the open window before she was halfway across the bridge. Mud and salt and the particular sweet rot of shell. She had not smelled it in 8 years. Something in her chest that had been clenched for most of a decade let go all at once, and she had to slow the car down because her eyes had gone blurry and the bridge had no shoulder. She slept that first night in the car, in the gravel lot behind a bait shop that had been there since before she was born, with the windows cracked and the sound of the water against the riprap putting her under faster than any bed in New Orleans ever had. In the morning, she crossed the bridge into Apalachicola to look for work, because work was the only plan she had, and that was where she met Royce. Apalachicola is the older town, the county seat, a grid of brick storefronts and Greek Revival houses left over from the years before the Civil War, when it was the third largest cotton port on the Gulf. The cotton went, and the timber went, and for most of a century, what was left was oysters and shrimp, and now even those were thin. But the working waterfront was still there, down at the foot of the hill where the Apalachicola River came into the bay, a row of seafood houses and ice plants and dockage. And that was where Della went, because a waterfront is the one place where her grandfather's knowledge was still worth something. She was standing at the end of a dock, watching a man mend a shrimp net, when he spoke to her without looking up. He was in his 70s, lean and burned brown, with white stubble and forearms like cypress knees, and he had a net needle moving through the mesh in a rhythm that did not stop while he talked. "You're Pap Ferris's granddaughter," he said. It was not a question. She said she was. He tied off the twine and looked at her then, the long, measuring look of a man who has decided most things in his life by looking at them. "Royce Tolliver," he said. "I tonged the bay alongside your grandfather 40 years. You favor him." He went back to the net. "What are you doing back here?" She told him the truth, which was that she had run out of city and come home and needed work. He nodded the way he had nodded at everything, as if she had only confirmed something he already suspected. He did not offer sympathy. What he offered, after a long silence, filled only with the soft pull of twine through mesh, was a problem. The marina up the river had a boat coming up for a fee sale at the end of the week. A wooden shrimper, 38 feet, owned by a man named Emile Lanier, who had died 2 winters back with no family anyone could find and 2 years of back dockage owed. The marina was going to sell her for scrap value to clear the slip. Royce had been trying to keep it from happening. "She's a good boat," he said. "Built right. Spruced up, cypress over oak frames, the way they did it before fiberglass. Emile kept her 40 years. It'd be a sin to cut her up." He looked at Della again. "Fees come to a little over the price of nothing. Marina'll take $1 and the back paper off the books just to be shut of it. You want to go look at her?" She did not answer right away. She had come home with $200 and no plan past finding a kitchen to work in. A boat was the last thing she needed. But she heard Pap in the back of her mind, in the part of her that had never stopped being a waterman's child, and she heard herself say, "Yes," before she had finished arguing with herself. And Royce set down his net needle and stood up off the bucket he'd been sitting on like it cost him something and said, "Truck's up the hill." The Marguerite was tied up at the far end of the marina, away from the working boats, in the corner where the marina put the things it had given up on. She sat low and tired in the brown river water, listing a few degrees to port, her white paint gone grey and flaking to the bare wood beneath. She was a classic Gulf shrimper, the kind Della had grown up seeing by the dozen and now saw rarely, with a high, flaring bow, a deckhouse forward, and the long, sloping afterdeck, where the rigging and the booms had been. The booms themselves bare now, the nets long gone. Across the stern, in faded paint, was her name and her port. Marguerite. Apalachicola, Florida. Della stepped down onto the deck and felt the boat take her weight and settle, the slow, living movement of a hull on water. And something she had not felt in 8 years moved through her. The specific recognition of being in the right place on the wrong day. The deck was sound underfoot, the cypress planking soft at the edges but solid. Royce came down behind her, surprisingly light for an old man, and stood with his hands in his pockets and let her look. She looked the way Pap had taught her. She crouched and ran her hand along the covering board and felt where the cork had failed in the deck seams. She looked at the way the boat sat in the water and read the list as ballast or bilge water, not a breach, which meant the hull was likely tighter than it appeared. She put her head into the deckhouse and smelled diesel and mildew and the cold iron smell of an engine left to sit, an old 4-cylinder workboat diesel of a kind half the Gulf fleet had once run, a Detroit, a 2-stroke Jimmy by the shape of the blower, seized now but not gone. The wheel was wooden, worn pale where 40 years of hands had held it. There was a bunk, a small galley with a 2-burner propane stove gone green with corrosion, a chart table with the charts still on it, swollen and water-stained, of the bay and the passes and the Gulf beyond. "How much work?" she asked, and Royce said, 6 months if you're good. A year if you learn as you go. The engine's the worst of it. Hull's better than she looks. Emil took care of her. He paused, looking at the seized Detroit. Cork the deck seams before anything, or you'll rot her from the top down. That's the thing nobody understands about a wooden boat. It ain't the water under her that kills her. It's the rain on top. He looked at Della. "You know how to drive a caulking iron and a mallet?" "Yes. You know what oakum is?" "Tarred hemp. You drive it into the seam, then pay it with cotton and seam compound." Royce's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Pap teach you that?" "Yes. Figures." The marina office took her dollar and a signature, and seemed glad to be rid of both the boat and the paperwork, and by noon the Marguerite was hers, and Royce had driven back to East Point to get his tools, and Geller was standing alone on the deck of a 38-foot wooden shrimper she had no business owning, in the town she had left to get away from, holding the title to the first thing she had owned outright in her life. She spent that first afternoon clearing the deckhouse, hauling out the rotted mattress and the corroded stove, and 3 milk crates of trash that had drifted in over 2 years. And as the light went gold over the river and the marina went quiet, she stopped working and sat on the deck with her back against the deckhouse and watched a pair of brown pelicans work the channel. The tide had turned. She could read it off the pilings the way Pap had shown her, the wet line on the wood, the current pulling the boat gently against her lines. There was a soft frost warning on the radio for the Panhandle in 3 days, the first cold of the year, early. She had a boat that did not float well, an engine that did not run, $200, and a knife roll. She had never felt more like herself. That night, she slept aboard for the first time, on a foam pad on the deckhouse sole, with the river slapping the hull and an owl calling somewhere in the cypress on the far bank. Before she lay down, she had taken a flashlight forward into the cramped triangle of the forepeak under the bow, where the anchor rode and the spare gear was stored, meaning only to see what she had to clean out. The beam fell on coils of stiff old line, a galvanized bucket, a wooden grating, and behind all of it, wedged up under the breasthook, where the two sides of the bow came together, lashed in place with marlin against the roll of the sea, was a wooden chest with brass corners gone green, the kind of chest a man keeps when he means to keep a thing dry for a long time. She knelt in the narrow space with the flashlight in her teeth and put her hand on the lid. The wood was cold and smooth. There was a hasp, and through the hasp, an iron padlock, rusted solid. She could not lift the lid. She tugged at the lashing, and it held, tarred and tight, tied by someone who had known exactly the knot for the job. It was full dark now, and she was tired in her bones, and the cold was coming in 3 days, and there was an engine to deal with and a deck to caulk. The chest had waited 2 years. It could wait until morning. She backed out of the forepeak and lay down on the foam pad and listened to the water. And she thought, just before sleep took her, that whoever had lashed that chest in place under the bow had done it the way you do a thing you mean to last longer than yourself. She was awake before the light, the way she had always woken on the water as a child, and the first thing she did was reach for a tool. Royce had come at first light the day before with a milk crate of his own gear and laid it out on the deck without ceremony. A caulking mallet of live oak worn smooth at the head, 3 caulking irons of different widths, a hank of oakum, a bag of cotton wicking, a tin of seam compound, a paint scraper, a putty knife. "Deck first," he had said. "Always the deck. You let the rain in through the seams up top, and it runs down inside the planking where you can't see it, and rots her from the inside. And one day a frame lets go, and you find out about it in a blow." So before she let herself go forward to the chest, she made herself do the deck, because that was the order of things, and because she suspected that if she opened the chest first, she would not be able to do anything else that day. She worked on her knees in the cold, with the river fog still on the water. The first cold of the year had come in overnight. The frost warning made good, and the deck was slick with it, and her breath showed. She raked the old failed caulk out of a seam with the scraper, a black, crumbling rope of it, 40 years dead, and swept the seam clean. And then she did the thing Pap's hands had taught hers to do before her mind had words for it. She took a length of oakum and rolled it on her thigh into a loose strand, and laid it into the seam, and set the iron, and swung the mallet. The sound a caulking mallet makes is unlike any other sound, a hollow, musical knock that changes pitch as the seam fills. And a good caulker works by ear as much as by eye, listening for the note that says the seam is hard. She drove the oakum down the length of one seam, and the note came up under her hands, and she knew it for what it was. And she sat back on her heels with her hands aching and her breath smoking, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could account for, completely present in her own life. Royce came at 8 with 2 paper cups of coffee from the gas station and a sack of day-old donuts, and sat on an overturned bucket and watched her work a seam without saying anything for a long time. When she finished the seam and looked up, he handed her a coffee. "Your iron's a hair too wide for that seam," he said. "Switch to the thin one, or you'll spread the planks." It was the only thing he said for an hour, and she understood it for what it was, which was a passing grade. He was a man who taught the way her grandfather had taught, by standing near you while you did the thing and saying the one thing that needed saying, and letting the rest of it be learned by your hands. He stayed until noon. They caulked and paid 12 seams between them, and he showed her how to mix the seam compound to the right body, loose enough to push, stiff enough to stay. And when he left, he said he'd come back in the morning and look at the engine with her, and that she should not, under any circumstances, try to start the Detroit before he did, because a seized diesel run dry would throw a rod, and then she'd have a 38-foot planter and nothing else. She worked the seams alone all that afternoon, the cold sun crossing the river, the marina quiet around her except for the slap of water and the cry of gulls, and once the long, low note of a tug coming up the river with a barge. By evening, her shoulders had the deep ache she remembered from hall days with Pap, the honest ache that meant the day had been spent on something real. And the deck was sound, from the deckhouse to the transom, every seam hard and paid and waiting only for paint. She had not gone forward to the chest. She had told herself she would not until the deck was done. And the deck was done. And now there was nothing left between her and it but her own reluctance, which she did not fully understand. She understood it a little better when she was on her knees in the forepeak again, with the flashlight and the marline lashing under her hands. Whatever was in the chest had belonged to a man who had loved this boat for 40 years and died with no one to leave it to, and opening it felt less like curiosity than like trespass, like reading a letter addressed to someone else. But the chest was hers now. It had come with the boat, and the boat had come to her, and there was no one else, and that was either an accident or it was the way these things sometimes went, and she had stopped, in the last week, being sure which. She cut the marline with her rigging knife, the good knot giving way strand by tarred strand, and worked the chest free from under the breast hook. It was heavier than it looked. She dragged it back into the deckhouse where the light was better and where she could sit with it, and she looked at the rusted padlock for a while, and then she got the hacksaw from Royce's milk crate and cut through the hasp, because the lock would never open, and the wood was too good to break. The hasp parted with a small, bright sound, and she set the saw down and lifted the lid. The smell came up first, the particular smell of old paper and machine oil and the faint sweetness of cypress, and beneath the lid, lying across the top of everything, was a piece of oilcloth folded over the contents to keep them dry, brittle now at the creases, but whole. She lifted it away. Underneath, the chest was packed with the carefulness of a methodical man. There was a wooden cigar box, the kind that had not been made in 50 years, and inside it, a roll of bills, held with a perished rubber band that broke when she touched it, old 20s and 10s, and a few 50s, and beneath them, a layer of silver, half-dollars and dimes, and a stack of silver dollars wrapped in tissue gone yellow. She did not count it then. She would count it later, with Royce, the way you count a thing you do not entirely believe, and it would come to a little over $19,000. 4 decades of a careful man putting aside what a careful man could put aside, which, on the water, in a town that was losing its water, was never very much, and was, set against 40 years, a kind of monument. But it was not the money that stopped her. Under the cigar box was a flat packet wrapped in a square of canvas, and inside the canvas was a stack of photographs and a leather-cornered notebook, and on top, a single folded sheet of paper that had been written on both sides in a slow, careful hand. A hand that had clearly not held a pen often, the letters formed with the effort of a man more used to a net needle and a wrench. Across the top, underlined twice, it said, "How to run a boat right." And below that, numbered down the page and onto the back, were the rules. She read them, sitting on the deckhouse sole, with the light going, and the cold coming up through the planking. And she did not move until she had read them all, twice. There were 19 of them. Some of them were about boats. Most of them, she came to understand, were not. 1. The deck before everything. Rain on top kills more boats than water under. 2. Never run her dry. Oil her like you'd want to be oiled if you were the one doing the work. 3. The bay will feed you if you don't take more than your share. Take your share and leave the rest, and there will be a next year. 4. Learn the names of things. A man who can't name a thing can't fix it and can't ask for help with it. 5. When the glass falls fast, go in. There is no shrimp worth a boat, and there is no boat worth a man. 6. Pay what you owe before you spend what you want. A boat will sink you slower than debt, but it will sink you the same. 7. The old men on the dock know things you don't. Buy them coffee and shut up and listen. You'll learn more than in any book. 8. When you're wrong, say so quick. The water doesn't care about your pride, and neither does anyone worth knowing. 9. Keep her clean. A clean boat tells you when something's wrong. A dirty boat hides it until it's too late. 10. Don't fish a falling tide off the east bar in a north wind. You will go aground, and you will deserve it. 11. Fix the small thing the day you see it. The small thing is how the big thing gets in. 12. A boat is a promise you make to the water every morning. Keep it. 13. Marry the work, not the catch. Some years there's no catch. There's always work. 14. Be kind to the young ones coming up. Somebody was kind to you, even if you've forgotten who. 15. The river always wins in the end. Your job is not to beat it. Your job is to dance with it as long as you can. 16. Eat what you catch. Sell the rest fresh. Frozen is for people who've given up. 17. When you can't sleep, go look at her lines in the moonlight. It will remind you why. 18. Don't let the boat outlive its purpose and rot at the dock. Better she goes to someone who'll work her. 19. If you read this far, then I'm gone, and she's yours now, whoever you are. Take care of her. She took care of me when there was nobody else. Her name is Marguerite, and I named her for my daughter, and I'll tell you about that if you find the rest of it. E. Eldella sat with the page in her hands in the dark. She had run a kitchen brigade of 14 people. She had been screamed at by chefs and had screamed back. She had plated 400 covers on a Saturday night and broken down the line at 2 in the morning and done it again the next day for 6 years. And somewhere in all of it, she had stopped believing that anyone wrote things down for anyone else, that anything she did would outlast the night it was done in. And here was a man she had never met, dead 2 years, who had spent 40 years on a boat alone and had taken the trouble, near the end, to write down what he knew for whoever came after him, on the chance that someone would. I named her for my daughter, and I'll tell you about that if you find the rest of it. She read that line a 3rd time. Then she turned to the photographs. There were not many. A young man in a navy uniform, unsmiling. A date in pencil on the back, 1961. The same man, older, on the deck of the Marguerite when her paint was new. A boom-rigged shrimper in her prime. A good catch hanging in the net behind him. A woman, dark-haired, laughing, holding a baby. And the baby grown into a girl of 7 or 8, gap-toothed, standing on the same deck where Della was sitting now, holding up a small crab with both hands and grinning at whoever held the camera. On the back, in the careful hand, Marguerite, age 8. Della looked at the girl for a long time. She did not yet know the story. But she knew the shape of it, because the shape of it was carved into half the families in East Point, the ones whose children went away to the cities and did not come back, or came back too late. And she felt the page in her hands the way you feel the weight of something handed to you that you did not ask to carry and cannot put down. The notebook was the last thing. It was a logbook, in the strict sense, a record of 40 years of working the boat. She opened it at random and read a page. March 14th. Out at 4. Worked the west bar to the line. 11 baskets, mostly small. Wind backed to the north by noon. Came in early. Saw Royce coming back too. He had the same. Ice up to 40 cents. Another page. August 2nd. Glass falling all morning. Storm in the Gulf. They say it'll come up the bay. Tied her up double and went to the house. Lost 2 days, but she rode it out. A boat will ride out more than you think, if you tie her right. The whole of a life on the water, day by day, weather and catch, and the price of ice. The small economy of a man who had asked for very little and recorded all of it. At the back, separate from the dated entries, were a few pages in a different ink, written later, and these were not about the boat. These she would read slowly, over the weeks to come, because they were about the daughter, and they were hard to read, and she did not want to read them all at once. She closed the notebook. The light was gone. She had not eaten. The cold had come up through the deck and into her, and she was shaking a little, and she did not entirely know why. In the morning, she told Royce about the chest, and the money, and the list, and the photographs, and the line about the daughter. They were sitting on the dock with the valve covers off the Detroit, Royce's hands black with old grease, and he was quiet for a long while after she finished. The way she was learning he got quiet when something true was said. Émile Lanier, he said finally. I knew him 50 years. We fished the same water. He never said 2 words you didn't have to pull out of him. He wiped his hands on a rag. His girl, Marguerite. She'd be near 60 now if she'd lived. He let that sit. She didn't? Royce shook his head slowly. Went off to Atlanta when she was 19, 20. Married a fellow up there. They had a falling out, her and Émile. The kind families have, over nothing that matters once it's too late. She meant to come back. They always mean to come back. He looked out at the river. She got sick. Cancer, fast kind. By the time anybody got word to Émile and he drove up there, she was 3 days gone. He never talked about it. He named the boat for her, before any of it, when she was a baby. So every day for 40 years, he ran a boat with his daughter's name on the stern. I always wondered if that made it better or worse. Never asked. You didn't ask Émile things. I have held that list myself, the actual sheet of paper, in the reading room of the Maritime Museum, where it lives now under glass beside the logbook. And I can tell you, the hand is exactly what she described. A working man's hand fighting the pen, the lines pressed deep enough to feel from the back of the page. The bay was the system Pap had told her about, and the boat was a system she could learn, and the engine was a system Royce could teach her. But a man who runs his dead daughter's name across the water every morning for 40 years was not a system. And Della understood, sitting on that dock in the cold sun, that she had bought more than a boat. She had bought a stranger's grief and a stranger's care, knotted together so tightly that one could not be had without the other, and that the only honest thing to do with it was the thing Emile had asked, which was to take care of the boat, and through the boat, somehow, to take care of him. They turned to the engine because there was nothing to say that the work would not say better. Royce showed her how to pull the injectors and how to bar the engine over by hand to free the rings, working penetrating oil into each cylinder day after day, a little at a time, with the patience of a man who has freed 100 seized engines and knows that the only enemy is hurry. "She'll come," he said. "Detroit'll outlast us both if you treat her right." Loud as the end of the world and simple as a hammer. Emile used to say they built 1,000,000 of them. So there's nothing wrong with her you can't find the part for, or the man who's seen it before. They worked through the morning, and the cold burned off, and a heron came and stood in the shallows by the dock and watched them. And Della found that she was happy in a way she had no name for, and was a little afraid of it. The way you are afraid of a thing you have wanted so long you stopped admitting you wanted it. That night, the first true freeze came down on the bay, harder than the radio had called for, a cold snap pushing far down out of the north, the way they do once or twice a panhandle winter. And the marina water went still and cold, and the rigging of the working boats ticked with frost. Della lay on the foam pad in the deckhouse under every blanket she owned, the chest closed again beside her, the list folded in the breast pocket of her shirt, where she had put it without quite deciding to, and she could not sleep. She remembered Rule 17. When you can't sleep, go look at her lines in the moonlight.
So she got up
And pulled on Pap's wool sweater and her boots, and went out onto the frosted deck, and walked up onto the dock, and stood looking back at the Marguerite in the moonlight, her hull dark against the silver water, her bare booms raked up against the stars, and saw what Emile had meant. The lines of a boat at rest are an argument that the world makes sense. She stood there in the cold a long time, and it was then, looking at the boat, that she heard it, a slow, steady drip from somewhere below the waterline, water coming in, not a lot, but coming, the sound of a seam working open under the bow in the cold, the sound of the thing she did not yet know how to fix, beginning to go wrong. She did not panic, because Pap had taught her that panic is just a decision you make to be useless. She went below with the flashlight and found the water, a slow weep along a garboard seam down near the keel where the plank met the deadwood, the place the list had been hiding all along. It was the cold that had done it, the planking shrinking in the freeze, and a seam that had been tired for years finally letting go. It was not fast. The bilge held an inch, no more, and the boat was in no danger that night. But Rule 11 was in her shirt pocket, along with all the others. Fix the small thing the day you see it. The small thing is how the big thing gets in. She bailed the bilge with a coffee can, the way she had bailed it the first day, and she stuffed the weeping seam from inside with a twist of cotton soaked in seam compound as a stopgap, the way Royce would later tell her was exactly right for a cold night, and exactly wrong for a permanent fix. And then she sat with her back against the cold hull and waited for morning, because there was nothing more to be done in the dark, and a waterman learns early that half of the work is waiting for the light. In the morning, Royce looked at the seam and nodded. "Garboard," he said. "Always the garboard. She'll have to come out." And so began the 8 months that remade the boat, and, Della would come to think later, remade her. They hauled the Marguerite out at a yard up the river that still had a marine railway, a cradle on iron wheels that ran down an inclined track into the water on a steel cable, the same way boats had been hauled for 100 years. Royce knew the man who ran it, of course. Royce knew everyone. And the yard gave Della a corner and a price she could meet because Emile had been one of theirs. Out of the water, in the cold January light, the Marguerite told the truth about herself, and the truth was better than the harbour master had promised, and worse than Della had hoped. The hull was sound in its bones, the oak frames hard and dry, the cypress planking tight everywhere, but along the garboard, where 40 years and one hard freeze had finally opened the lowest seam on both sides. 2 planks had to come out. Della had never replaced a plank in her life. She learned. Royce showed her how to back out the old fastenings, square bronze boat nails set by a man 2 generations gone, and how to spile a new plank, transferring the exact curve of the opening onto a board with a batten and a pencil and a pair of dividers, a piece of geometry done with the hands that had not changed in 300 years. They got out cypress, real old-growth cypress, salvaged from a sinker log a man up the river had pulled from the bottom where it had lain since the timber days. Wood so dense and rot-proof it turned the saw, and Della cut the planks and beveled the seams and steamed the wood limber in a length of stovepipe over a fire of scrap, and bent it home against the frames while it was hot and screaming, and set the fastenings, and caulked the new seams with oakum and cotton, and paid them, listening for the note. And when she stood back, the hull was whole. Royce ran his hand along the new wood where it met the old. "You can see where she was hurt," he said, "but she's stronger there now than she was. That's how it works with a good repair. The mend is stronger than the whole." He did not look at Della when he said it, and she did not look at him, and they both understood it had not been entirely about the boat. The rest of the winter was hull. She ground the bottom and burned off 40 years of anti-fouling paint down to bright wood, and treated the wood and painted it with copper-bottom paint. 3 coats, the dull red of every working hull on the Gulf. She replaced the cutlass bearing and repacked the stuffing box where the propeller shaft came through the hull, the very thing Pap had taught her the name of on a skiff when she was 9. No, 10. She had been 10, the summer he let her run the outboard. Memory does that on the water. The past comes loose and floats up. She repacked it with flax and graphite and set it so it dripped the slow drip it was supposed to drip, because a stuffing box that doesn't drip is a stuffing box that's burning. And that was Rule 4, in a way Emile had not written down. Learn the names of things, and then learn what the things are supposed to do, which is a harder and longer lesson. The Detroit came to life in March. They had worked penetrating oil into the cylinders for 6 weeks, a little at a time, and barred her over by hand until she turned freely, and rebuilt the injectors, and bled the fuel line, and changed every drop of oil and grease in her. And on a cold, bright morning, Royce hit the starter, and the old 2-stroke caught on the second turn, and came up roaring, the way a Detroit comes up, all blow-a-whine and clatter, no warning and no apology, settling after a minute into the hard, even drone that every dock on the Gulf knows in its sleep. Gela stood on the deck and listened to it, and put her hand flat on the deckhouse over the running engine and felt it through the wood. And Royce watched her do it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the engine was not already saying. Spring was the cabin and the systems. She rebuilt the galley around Pap's cast-iron skillet and a new 2-burner propane stove, properly vented this time, with a regulator and a shut-off and a detector on the bulkhead, because Rule 11, because the small thing. She built a bunk that fit her and drawers underneath, and a fold-down table off the bulkhead and shelves for books, the marine manuals and the field guides, and a battered copy of a Steinbeck novel about the Gulf of California. A woman named Lurleen, who ran the Apalachicola Library 3 days a week, tracked Della down at the yard one afternoon because word had gotten around about the logbook. 40 years of catch and weather and ice prices was, Lurleen said, exactly the kind of thing the Maritime Museum down on the waterfront was always looking for and almost never got, because watermen did not keep records, or kept them and threw them out, or kept them and let them rot in a shed. A complete 40-year working log of the Apalachicola fishery was something a historian would weep over. Della said she would think about it. She was not ready yet to let the logbook out of her hands. She painted the topsides in May, 3 coats of white marine enamel, because a shrimper is white. That was not negotiable. White with a dark green sheer stripe that Royce said was the color Emile had always run, and she repainted the name across the stern by hand. With a fine brush and a steady wrist, she had earned over 400 Saturdays of plating. Marguerite, Apalachicola, Florida. The letters crisp and black. The name of a girl who had grinned on this deck, holding a crab with both hands, and never grown old. When it was done, the boat did not look new. Royce had been firm about that. Don't make her look new, he had said. She's not new. Make her look cared for. There's a difference, and everybody on this dock will know which one you did. So Della made her look cared for, and when the Marguerite went back down the marine railway into the river in early June and floated off the cradle and sat on her lines exactly the way a boat should sit, level and easy, the men working the yard stopped what they were doing and came down to look, and one of them, an old shrimper named Dewey, took off his cap, which Della did not understand until Royce told her later that Dewey had crewed for Emile as a boy. The town came the way the towns in these stories always come, which is to say, slowly, one at a time, by way of work and not words. It is worth pausing here, because this is the part outsiders never believe, and the part the people who have lived it recognize at once. Nobody welcomed Della. There was no moment. What happened instead was that a man named Buck, who ran the ice house at the foot of the hill, started selling her ice at the waterman's price instead of the retail price, without being asked and without saying why. And that was the welcome. A woman named Verna, who fried mullet at a place on the highway, started setting aside the heads and frames for Della's stockpot, because she had heard the new girl on the Lanier boat could cook, and that was the welcome. Dewey showed up one morning with a coil of good used line and a box of bronze fastenings he'd been saving for a boat that never came, and left them on the deck and waved off thanks. And that was the welcome. They came because she had shown up and stayed and done the work, and not made a fuss, and not asked anyone to admire her for any of it, which, on a working waterfront, is the only currency that spends. What Della had stumbled into is real, and it is more available than most people raised in cities have any way of knowing. And it is worth being precise about, because precision is the difference between a thing you can do and a thing you only daydream about. Apalachicola is a town of around 2,300 people now, down from the cotton port tens of thousands, holding on by oysters that mostly aren't there anymore, and shrimp that mostly aren't either, and a slow tide of people discovering that the working coast is one of the last places in America where a person without money can still buy a way of life for the price of the work it takes to keep it. The oyster fishery that built East Point collapsed in 2012. The bay was closed to wild harvest entirely a few years later. The reasons were not the simple ones people like to give. It was not just pollution. It was fresh water, or the lack of it. The river upstream, drawn down by cities and farms in Georgia, until the bay turned too salty, and the oyster's enemies, the conch and the drill and the disease, moved in where the fresh water used to hold them off. It was over-harvest in the panic years when everyone knew it was ending and took what they could. It was 100 small things, the way the big thing always is. But the boats are still cheap, and the watermen are still there, the old ones, with everything they know, and they will teach it to anyone who shows up and means it, because the alternative is to let it die with them. And Rule 14 is be kind to the young ones coming up. The seasons turned the way they do, and Della did not so much settle into the life as discover she had never not been living it. The 8 years in the city began to seem like a long-held breath. She shrimped. She learned the otter trawl from Royce, the doors and the tickler chain and the lazy line, and worked the river and the near bay for the brown shrimp in summer and the white in form. Never far out, the Marguerite was not a Gulf boat, and never taking more than her share, Rule 3, and selling what she caught fresh off the deck, and to the one fish house left that bought local. And frozen is for people who've given up, Rule 16. So she did not freeze. It was not a living, quite, not by itself. She cooked too, 3 nights a week, at a place on the water that had heard what she could do, working a line again, but a small one, her own hours, for people who came back. Between the boat and the kitchen, carefully managed, it was enough. She was not getting rich. Rich had never been the thing. Rich had been the city's word for it, and the city had been wrong. She gave the logbook to the Maritime Museum in the fall, after she had read every page, including the hard ones at the back, about the daughter, which she read alone, on the deck, in the evenings, a few at a time. She gave them the photographs too, copies, heaping the originals, and the museum mounted a small exhibit, a single case, with the logbook open under glass, and the photograph of Marguerite, age 8, holding her crab, and a card that told as much of the story as Della and Royce and Dewey and the old men on the dock could piece together, which was not all of it, because nobody alive knew all of it, and Della had grown comfortable with that, had come to believe that a story you can't finish is more honest than one you can. The exhibit drew people. Waterman's families came and stood in front of the case for a long time. A woman drove down from Atlanta one weekend, a granddaughter of the daughter's husband by a second marriage, no blood to a meal at all, and stood in front of the photograph and cried. And Della took her out to the boat and let her stand on the deck where the girl had stood. And that was a thing Della had not known she had it in her power to give until she gave it. She kept her own logbook now. She had started it without quite deciding to, the way she had done most of the important things of the last year. An ordinary ledger from the hardware store in which she wrote the date and the tide and the weather and the catch, the way Emile had, the way she imagined Pap would have if Pap had been a writing man. March 14. Out at 4. Worked the west bar to the line, the way Emile worked it, the way the log says he worked it. 6 baskets. The herons are back on the dock. Ice up to $1.10. She did not copy Emile's entries. She continued them in her own hand, in a new book, which is a different thing entirely, and which is, when you think about it, the only kind of inheritance that does not run out. There is a line in Emile's list that she did not understand for a long time. Rule 15. The river always wins in the end. Your job is not to beat it. Your job is to dance with it as long as you can. She had read it the first night as a kind of fatalism, an old man's resignation. She understood it differently now. The river had won against Emile in the end, as it wins against everyone. He was gone, and the bay was failing, and the town was a third of what it had been. But for 40 years, he had danced, alone, on a boat with his lost daughter's name on the stern, paying attention, keeping the deck before everything, fixing the small thing the day he saw it, and writing it all down for a stranger he would never meet, on the chance that the chance would come. That was not losing. That was the only kind of winning the water allowed. And it was enough. And Emile had known it was enough, and had tried, with 19 rules and a chest under the bow, to tell her so. One evening, late in her first full year, she could not sleep, and she remembered Rule 17, and she pulled on Pap's wool sweater and her boots, and went up onto the dock, and stood looking back at the Marguerite in the moonlight. The cold had come down again, the second winter, and the rigging ticked with frost, and the boat sat dark and easy on the silver water, with her bare booms raked